Hello and welcome to the running, sliding, and crouching tutorial. Just to show you what it looks like. So you can walk around normally. If you press C, you'll see you'll crouch. And if you let go, you'll uncrouch. And if you hold down Shift, you'll run quicker. And if you crouch while you're sprinting, you'll do a slide. And while you're sliding, you can kind of look around like so. So yeah, I had somebody ask me to do this tutorial specifically because it's not quite as easy as you might think, especially to get the crouching nice and smooth and to get all the transition states correct. So with that being said, let's go ahead and just jump right into it. So I'm going to start from scratch for you guys. So open up the Epic Games launcher and launch the latest version of the engine that you have. I'm using 4.23.1. I guess I have 4.24.1, but I haven't ran that one yet, so I'll just use this one. And then go to New Projects and make sure Blueprint is selected. And we want to go with the first person, this one, the first person template. And I'm just going to call it Movement Tutorial or something like that. And then we're going to go ahead and create the project. I'm going to move this one over here. So just give it a second. All right, so you can see if we run it now, we already have the walking functionality. And we don't have any crouching or sliding or sprinting. So that's basically what we're going to be adding. So the first thing we're going to want to do is create an enum that keeps track of what state we're in. So like if we're currently standing up, walking, crouching, stuff like that. So right click down here in the content browser and go to Blueprints and click on enumeration. And we will call this E movement. And then once that's created, just double click on it. And at the top here, we want to add 3 new entries. So on the right, click new 3 times. The first one we're going to call standing. And this is going to be used for both like walking or sprinting. And we'll call this one crouching. And the last one will be sliding. And so go ahead and save that. And you can just close that for now. All right, so come back to the content folder, and then inside of first person blueprints, open up the first person character, which is just this guy right here. So there's a couple of things we need to do just to make this a little easier. We need to kind of delete some stuff, or we don't need to, but I'm going to do it just so there's not so much stuff in here, because there's a lot of stuff in here for VR. So come over here on the left, and we don't need this motion controller or this one. We don't need the VR gun or the VR marker because we're not doing anything with VR. That looks good. If you try to compile it now, it's going to give you some errors because we just deleted some stuff. That's fine. So go back to the event graph. Let me see. We don't need any of this stuff in begin play, so delete it. Keep the little begin play event because we're going to need that eventually. We don't need this reset VR over here to the right. All right, and then in this section where it's doing the movement input, there's like a little thing here for is head-mounted display enabled. That's never going to be true for us, so we can delete that, delete the select, and delete these two. So we want to just hook up the get actor forward vector into here, and we want to do the same thing for this. So delete these, and we want the get actor right vector hooked up to there. And you'll see why I'm doing this later, because it's just kind of annoying to have that stuff when you don't need it. Spawn projectile, if you want to keep this, go ahead. I'm just going to delete it because I don't care about it for this tutorial. Alright, so this is a nice clean slate to be working from. This is pretty much the stuff we actually need. So after that, we need to create some input bindings for crouching and sprinting. So go up to the project settings, and under edit, project settings. On the left, there's input down here. Click on that. And we want to create two action mappings. So the first one, if you click the little plus, we're going to call sprinting. And the key I'm going to use for this is shift. You can use whichever one you want. And then we'll create one more, and we'll call it crouching. And I'm going to use C for crouching. Again, feel free to choose whichever one you want. All right, and then once we got that, we can just close this window and then come back to the first person character. So now that we have those input bindings created, we can bind to them. So come down here towards the bottom and right click and search for input action sprinting. And under pressed, we want to basically start sprinting, and when we release it, we want to, when we press it, we want to start sprinting, and when we release it, we want to stop sprinting. Now, it's not quite as simple as like just increasing your speed, because there could be times where you press the sprint key like while you're in the middle of a slide, but then when you come out of the slide, you want to start sprinting even though you're not pressing it as you get out of the slide. So you want to remember the current value of this. So to do that, we're going to come over here and we're going to create a variable, and I'm going to call it sprint key down, and make sure it's set to Boolean. And I'm also going to come over here under the category, and I'm going to create a movement category just so we can kind of separate our variables from the existing ones, like so. Okay, so for right now, we're going to say when you press the sprinting button, we're going to set the sprint key down to true, and copy and paste. And when you release it, we're going to set it to false. Okay, so basically at this point, we want to say increase the player's speed, and over here we want to say, set the player's speed back to whatever his walking speed is. So to do that, we need a couple of things first. We need a couple variables to keep track of what speeds we want to speed up to and slow down to whenever you start and stop sprinting. So if you look at the character movement component on the left here, and you search for max walk speed, you'll see there's already a max walk speed defined set to 600. And we don't want to do anything too hacky. We want to try to like use this value and not just like totally ignore it, because this is basically the speed that you're going to walk at whenever you start moving. So ideally, when you start sprinting, we want to just like change this value from like 600 to 900 or something, and then set it back to 600 whenever you stop sprinting. And that way, if a designer or yourself comes along later and you say, you know what, I want my player to walk 500 instead, it'll actually get applied here, and you won't have to remember to like change it somewhere else in code. So we're gonna keep this at 600, and we're gonna read this value when the program starts. So come up here to begin play, and basically what we want to say is get the character movement component, and we want to get that max get max walk speed. So this is the max walk speed when the game starts, and we want to save this value. So right click, promote to variable, and we will call it our walk speed. And I'm going to also move this to another category, and I'm going to call it movement constants, because these are kind of like more or less constant variables that we don't want to change, that define like the speeds of things. And we'll have some other ones, so it'll make more sense in a second. Okay, so that's our walk speed. So our sprint speed, we're just simply going to say it's our walk speed times 1.5. And you can obviously make this whatever you want. I'm just doing this for simplicity. And then right click this and promote it to a variable. And so this will be our run speed, like so. So yeah, so when the game starts, it's going to remember our walk speed, and we're going to find our run speed based off of that. All right, so then back down here, in our sprint, we can simply say that our character movement set max walk speed. If we are sprinting, we're going to set it to our run speed. Or maybe I should call this sprint speed just to stay consistent. Sprint speed. There we go. And when we release it, go ahead and copy this. Except instead of run speed, instead of run speed, we want the walk speed. So if we go ahead and test this out now, we should be able to at least sprint when we hold down shift, which it looks like we are. Now we're going to have to change this a little bit because, like I said, it's not quite as simple as this in all cases, but go ahead and run it now and make sure that your character is sprinting when you expect him to sprint. All right, so after that, we'll start hooking up the crouching, and then we'll start running into some problems with sprinting, so we're going to have to change this pretty soon, but I kind of wanted to do that as I go so you can see why we're changing it. Okay, so this is our sprinting. We're going to add another event, the input action crouching event. So this is going to get called whenever we press the crouch key, whatever you have set that to. And just like sprinting, we want to keep track of if the crouch key is down. So over here, duplicate this and just say crouch key down. And so when we press it, we want to set this to true. And when we release it, we want to set it to false. All right, so I think at this point we should probably make use of this enum that we created at the beginning. If you remember, we made an enum for the movement type, and it is either standing, crouching, or sliding. So go back to the first person character, and we need to make another variable for our movement. So call it movement, and the type is of e movement, which is again that variable that we created, and drag that up to the movement category. So you can see if you compile it that by default it's set to standing, which is correct. So we want a way to basically check the current value of this in an easy way, because we could drag this out and say, like, do a switch statement and say, hey, what are we doing? But just to make things a little bit easier, I'm going to go ahead and create a macro. So if you come over here, you can click macro, and I'm just going to call it switch movement. Now don't get this word switch combined with like change. This is switch as in like a switch statement. So yeah, don't get that confused. So we're just gonna bring in our movement and we'll do a switch statement on it and hook that up like this. And we'll hook up standing, crouching, and sliding. Now one other thing we want to do is we will want to know if we're in the air, because we don't want to be able to like crouch or slide, for example, when we're in the air. And we don't really want to make that a movement mode just because Unreal kind of already handles like keeping track of if you're in the air or not. And it does that in the character movement component. So if you drag that in and off of that you say is falling, so this will return true if your character is ever falling. And if that's the case, then we actually want to return another thing from here. So click on outputs, click on plus, and we want one more for in air. And make sure you change this to execute. So we just want to maybe drag this out a little bit, drag this over, and we'll hold down B and left click to create a branch. Hook that up. Oops, I did that wrong. But okay, so if you're falling, it should be false. So if you're not falling, then we just want to, return whatever the movement mode is. But if you are falling, we want to basically drag this true down here into is in air. And I'm just gonna clean this up a little bit so it's a little easier to follow. Oops. Something like this, just so we can see where the lines go. So again, just to recap, we're saying If we are in the air, we're going to just return that we're in the air. If we're not in the air, we're going to return whatever our movement mode is, which is either standing, crouching, or sliding. So this little macro will be super helpful. We're going to be using it pretty much all over the place whenever we are switching from one mode to another. So we can come up here and actually hook this up already, because if you think about it, like when we're sprinting, or sorry, when the sprint key is pressed, we really only want to do something if we're standing. And by standing, I mean like walking. If we're crouched or we're sliding or we're in the air, in this case, I don't want to do anything. So we can easily add that logic by simply dragging in our macro right here and hooking it up, and only dragging out of the sliding or the standing pin. So basically, if we ever, if it ever gets here and we're currently crouching, it's just not going to proceed to change our speed at all. And you can go ahead and test that as well real quick. Actually, no, you can't, because none of this is hooked up. So never mind. We'll test that in a second. Okay, so now that we have this switch movement, oops. We also want to add it here for our crouching. So go ahead and copy it and hook it up like so. And we need another one for when we release crouching. So when you press the crouch key, we really only want to do something if, again, you're standing. If you're sliding or you're in the air or you're already crouching, we don't really care, and we don't really want to do anything. Now, if you're standing and you're sprinting, we want to slide. But if you're just standing and you're just walking at a normal speed, again, standing represents both walking and running, because you're standing as opposed to crouching when you're doing those things. So we want to know off of this node if you are currently running. So we have that based on if the sprint key is down. So if we drag that in, we can do a branch and drag that into here. So again, if the sprint key is down, we want to slide. So I'm just going to make a little to-do, add a comment, because we haven't quite got there yet. But basically, if this is true, add a little reroute node here just so you can see. We're going to do like a slide, right? But if it's not true and we're just walking, then we just want to go ahead and crouch. So there's a few things we need to do before we can crouch. There's like a built-in thing in Unreal for crouching and uncrouching, this little crouch function. From what I found, it kind of sucks. I've never really gotten it successfully to work. It's not smooth at all. I can't seem to control the height of it or anything like that. So I just said, screw it, I'm not going to use this. I'm just going to do it myself. And it's not too difficult. So if you think about it, when you want to crouch, if you come back here to your report, you basically want the camera to move down along with like your guy's hands, and you want this capsule to, shrink as well, so that, collision-wise, you're actually crouching as well. I don't know what this was. I'm just going to Control Z. Okay. So you can see by default, this is a little confusing, so I'll try to explain it the best I can. By default, the capsule half height, which is half of this capsule's height, is set to 96. So when we crouch, we probably want to just like cut that in half. And when we cut that in half, I don't know, let's say like 45. I know that's not half. But if we were to cut that like in half or make it smaller, then in Unreal, like in the background, this camera will also come down a little bit to follow it. And you will also fall to the ground a little bit, because you can see this thing is not quite on the ground, or it won't be in the ground once you shrink it. So then it will slide down a little bit even, oops. Well, your whole guy will slide down. I'm not sure if I can show that or not. But when you make the capsule smaller, your whole guy will like fall to the ground a little bit, because it's like, your legs are coming up towards your chest, so your guy's going to fall to the ground. So that will make the camera go down a little bit, but you're also going to want to make the camera go down a little bit more, so that it stays like in the same spot relative to this capsule. So basically what I'm trying to say is we want to do two things when you crouch. We want to shrink the capsule, and we want to move the camera down as well. So to do that, we're going to come back to our event graph, and very similar to how we did like this type of stuff where we calculated our walk speed and our sprint speed, we want to calculate some stuff for crouching and standing. So go ahead and duplicate the sprint speed just because it's in the right category. And we are going to call this the standing camera height, and duplicate it again, and we'll call it crouching, can't type, crouching camera height. I forgot an I in there or something, crouching. Okay, and then duplicate that again, and we will call it the standing capsule height, and duplicate it again, and we will call it the crouching capsule height. And I believe that's all we really need. So again, this is just the the height of the camera when you're standing, the height of the camera when you're crouching, the height of the capsule when you're standing, and the height of the capsule when you are crouching. So the standing ones we already have because that's what the defaults are set to. So we can drag out the standing camera height, and we're going to go ahead and set this to our, I think we want to set it to the camera's road position. Yeah, so drag in the first person camera over here, and we want to get the relative location, which is this guy down here. So this is where the camera is like relative to your character. Right click on that and split. And we want the Z component because that is the height. And again, we're doing this so that if somebody were to change this, like somebody says, oh, you know what, I want the camera to be up here, then everything will still just work because we are checking what that value is when the game starts. So you don't have to worry about changing any values whenever you change your character around here. So back to the event graph. So that's our standing camera height, and we're just going to say that our crouching camera height is whatever our standing, whatever our standing camera height is times some value. Now, we could definitely just say like 0.5 here, but I'm going to make a variable for this, and I'll explain why in just a second. So right click right here and say promote to variable, and we will just call this like crouch scale, and compile, and over here, yeah, we'll just keep it, actually 0.5 is probably a little bit too much. We'll say like 0.7. So the reason we wanted to make that a variable is because we want to modify the capsule by the same amount that we modify the camera. So we've set the standing camera height and the crouching camera height. Now we want to set the standing capsule height. So set this, and this is just going to be our capsule component, get half height, and our crouching capsule height, if we set this, again, we want to multiply it by the same crouch scale. So copy this and drag it like so. Okay, I believe now we're good. So now we know the heights of our camera and our capsule when we are both crouching and standing. And this again all happens in our begin play. So if we come back down here to where we're doing the crouching stuff, again, right here we want to say, we basically want to change our height, our camera height and our capsule height to be whatever they should be when you are crouched. So I'm going to make a little handy function here called set movement. And this is going to take in, oops, where did it go? Okay, this is going to take in as a parameter the movement. So standing, crouching, or sprinting. And make sure you set this to E movement. So the first thing we want to check is if this is already equal to our current movement. We should probably rename this to like new movement so it's a little more clear. So we want to say not equals, and we'll drag in our current movement, and hold down B and left click to create a branch. So if they're not equal, we want to do stuff. If they are equal, we don't really want to do anything because it's already set. So the first thing we want to do is we want to set our movement to our new movement. So we'll say set movement, and we'll type get new movement, like so. And then we're going to drag in our switch movement macro. And again, all this is doing is just doing like a switch statement on our movement, but it's also taking into account if we're in the air or not, which is going to be important for later. So I know we're currently working on crouching, but we should probably hook up the standing stuff now as well. Well, no, okay, we'll start with crouching. So if we are starting to crouch, then we basically want to lower our camera, right? And we want to lower our capsule's height. So we're going to come back here to the event graph, and we want to create some event for these because we're going to end up reusing them. So right click and say add custom event, and this will be called begin crouch, and we're going to want another one for end crouching. So right click again, add custom event, we'll call it end crouch. And while we're here, we might as well make one for the slide and just not fill it out yet. So right click again and say add custom event, and we'll call it begin slide. And this one doesn't need an end slide to it because the only way it ends the slide is when the slide finishes. At least in my implementation, that's the way it works. Okay, so going back to the set movement function, off of crouching, we want to say begin crouch. And oh, I forgot. So one thing we need to do is, again, we want to change the character's movement speed because when you're crouching, you should be a little bit slower. I just forgot to do this when we were making our speeds. So over here on the left, just right click and duplicate the sprint speed and call it crouch speed, and just drag that up here. And then back in the event graph at the top where we were doing our speeds, move this to the left, not this one. And we want to set our crouch speed to our walk speed times 0.5. So like half of our walk speed, basically. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. So now we have our crouch speed. So now back here in set movement, when after we begin our crouch, we also are going to want to change our speed. So drag in the character movement component, say set max walk speed, and we want to set that to our crouch speed. Oops. Crouch speed, like so. All right. Drag that back down here. Okay, so now when we go into standing, we want to call in crouch. Now this might not necessarily need to get called because you might be going from in the air to standing, but if that's the case, then this function just basically won't do anything, which is fine. We really just need this here so that once you let go of the crouch key and you go back to standing, your person will uncrouch again. All right, so once you're uncrouched, there's some important check we need to do here. Like I said before, we need to maintain the current state of sprint if the sprint key is down, and that's why we saved the sprint key down variable. So if you drag this in here, we'll do a branch, and we want to say if the sprint key is down, then we pretty much want to do exactly what we did in our sprint. We want to say, set the max walk speed to sprinting speed or walking speed, depending on if we're sprinting. So just go ahead and copy that and go back to set movement. So if the sprint key's down, then that goes there, and if it's not, then it goes there. And clean this up a little bit because it's ugly. Okay, so this check will be super helpful later, because it will just kind of figure out like if the sprint key is down for us, and we don't have to worry about like adding that check everywhere. Okay, so again, just to recap, when somebody says set movement, they tell us the movement they want to set to. We just want to make sure we're not already in that movement mode, and since we're not, we'll update our movement. If we're going to crouching, we're going to begin crouching, and we're going to reduce our speed. If we're going to standing, we're going to make sure that we're no longer crouching, and we're going to check if the sprint key's down. If the sprint key's down, we are going to set our max walk speed to our sprint speed, and if it's not, we're going to set our max walk speed to our walking speed. And we'll come back and we'll do the sliding one once we get crouching working. Okay, so now we have these two functions that we need to fill out, or these two events. So just double click on begin crouch so we can go and start filling that out. So again, like I said, we want to move the camera height from, like really high up when we're standing to like halfway down when we're crouching, and we want to change the capsule height as well. So to do that, we're going to create a timeline. And this will be called, like, I don't know, raise, lower camera. And when we begin crouching, we want to drag that into play. And when we end crouching, we want to drag it into reverse. So if you open this up, we just want to add a very simple timeline in here. So click this add float track. Maybe, there we go. And we'll call this our alpha value. And the length of it, we want to set to quarter of a second, so 0.25. And we want to create two keyframes, so right click, add keyframe, right click, add keyframe. And on the first one, we want to set the time to 0, and we want to set the value to 0. And on the right one, we want to set the time to 0.25, and we want to set the value to 1. And then if you click these two little buttons here to the left, it will make it so it fits nicely on your screen. And then one thing we want to do real quick is right click on each of these and select auto, and that will give us a nice, smooth, kind of natural curve. All right, so compile, save that, and then we can go ahead and close this. Come back to our event graph. Okay, so we're going to do two things with this alpha value, which again, this alpha value is just a value from 0 to 1. The first thing we want to do is we want to raise or lower the camera. So drag in the first person camera, and we want to say set relative location, and we'll drag it into the update. And the location that we want, we don't want to change the X or the Y. We only want to change the Z, which is the height of the camera. So if we go ahead and split this and drag off our first person camera again and get the current relative location, and split that, we want to hook up the X and the Y to whatever they were before so that they don't change. And then the Z value is something we want to change based off our alpha. So if you remember at the beginning or a little while ago, we created our standing camera height and our crouching camera height. So basically when we're standing, we want to use 100% of the standing camera height. And when we are crouching, we want to use 100% of the crouching camera height. So to do that, there's this handy little lerp function, LERP. And what this is going to do is it's going to take in an alpha value, which is our alpha value. It's just a value from 0 to 1. And when alpha is 0, it will use 100% of whatever you pass in for A. So for A, we will use our standing camera height. And for B, we will use our crouching camera height. So basically all this is saying is that over the course of 0.25 seconds, we want to start at our standing camera height, and we want to slowly move towards our crouching camera height. So this return value is the actual height, so we will hook it up like so. So now this will move our camera height. we might be able to test this now if I didn't screw anything up. So we'll start. We'll go ahead and run this. If I press C, nothing happens. Perfect. Let's see. What did I do wrong? If we're standing. Oh, okay. So I didn't actually hook this up yet. So come back here to the input action crouching graph. And again, if we press the crouch key and we are standing and the sprint key is not down, then we want to set movement to crouching. And we can kind of fill in our to do here as well. So we would just want to say set movement to sliding. And again, this doesn't do anything yet because we haven't filled out what happens when you slide, but we'll need that there for later. And the last thing we want to do is when you release the crouch key and you are crouching, we want to call set movement again, and we want to say to go back to standing. Okay, sorry, I had to go back and check something because I thought I had messed something up, but it turns out I didn't. I was just a little bit confused. One thing we should do before we run this though is the crouch scale. I changed that to 0.5. Actually, probably just keep it at 0.7. But make sure you move it up to the movement constants because it should probably go there. And again, just keep it at 0.7. So now if you go ahead and you run this and you hold down C, you'll see your character will move down smoothly and he'll stand up smoothly. Now you're probably thinking, okay, he's not moving very much. And the reason he's not moving very much is because we're not scaling the capsule. If you go back to the viewport or whatever and you click on the capsule component and search for hidden in game and unselect that just so you can see what's happening, you'll see when I crouch, I'm crouching inside of the capsule component and the capsule component is not actually shrinking at all, which is not what we want. So once we change it to shrink the capsule component, it will obviously get smaller, which is good, but it will also move our camera down even more. So I know it doesn't look like we're crouching very much right now, but once we do that, it will look better. So that's what we're going to do next. So back here, where our timeline is, we want to reuse this alpha value for the capsule height. So try to make this a little nicer looking. So drag that over, and then we're going to bring this down here so we can kind of make use of it over here to the right. So I'll be dragging off of this. Oops. I'll be dragging off of this in a second, which is why I wanted it down here. But we want to change, so we changed our camera height. We want to change our capsule height. So drag in the capsule component. And again, we want to set the capsule half height. Oops. And just like we did for the camera height, we want to use this lerp function. So go ahead and copy that. And the result we know is going to go into our half height. And the alpha value is, again, just our alpha value, like so. Make it a little nicer. Okay, so our A and our B are the values we want to interpolate between. So we already have those, which is nice. It is our standing capsule height and our crouching capsule height. And I believe that's all we need to do for that. So now if we go ahead and run this, you should see when we crouch, if you pay attention closely, hopefully you can see it on the YouTube video, but the capsule actually shrinks as well. I can probably show you much better if I run it this way. So this is what it looks like standing. And if I press F8 again and then crouch and then press F8, you can see, so this is what I look like crouched. The capsule is shrunken and my guy is also crouched much more as well. So if you think he should crouch more or less, you can change that crouch scale value to be whatever you want, and it will cause him to crouch more or less. Okay, so I think this is a good stopping point. So in the next video, I will go over how to hook up sliding into this.